we're going to be considering the relationship and engagement between the government and faith communities. Now, during the pandemic, the work of faith communities in delivering frontline services has been absolutely self-evident and widely regarded and noticed and praised by politicians across the board. It should be said, of course, that faith groups have always been involved in social action. That in itself is absolutely nothing new. But the kind of sort of overt signalling, noticing and comment from central government concerning that social action does feel like a very interesting and a rather novel shift. So that's what we're going to be looking at this afternoon. We were hoping to be joined by Colin Bloom, who is the Faith Engagement Advisor at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, who's currently leading a review into how best the government should engage with faith groups in England. But unfortunately, he can no longer join us because, given his relationship with the ministry, along with ministers and government officials, he's observing the period of mourning following the death of the Duke of Edinburgh. So it's a shame he can't be with us, but we actually do have a really dynamic panel this afternoon. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce them now. Daniel Singleton is the National Executive Director of Faith Action and an influential advocate for faith in a number of government departments, highlighting the significant contribution of faith-based organisations to communities across the UK. He's passionate about the role of faith in local services, how community groups can partner with government and how to engage the community in local action. Laura Marks, OBE, an interfaith social activist, policy advisor, writer and media commentator. Laura's founded and chaired a range of social organisations and in 2005 founded Mitzvah Day International, an annual day of faith-based social action that takes place each year in November, the UK's largest faith-led day of social action, now with over 40,000 participants actually taking part worldwide each year. And Laura's also a regular Radio 2 Pause for Thought contributor. And also we're joined by Julie Siddiqi, MBE, mentor, consultant, gender equality campaigner with a specific focus on Jewish, Muslim and other interfaith relations and applying that to social action work. With a 20-year background in community grassroots work, she's co-founder of the Big Iftar during Ramadan, founder and director of Sadaqah Day, I hope I've pronounced that right, but I'm sure she'll help me out if I haven't, a one-day Muslim-led focus on social action. And she works with Laura on the Jewish and Muslim Women's Network, Nisa Nashim. And Julie's also a regular Radio 4 Thought for the Day contributor. So thank you, all three of you, for joining us today. And I'm sorry Colin can't be with us, but I feel certain that there is plenty to say between all of you. So would you like to unmute yourselves so that we can hear what you have to say? Great. Good to have you all with us. Very good to have you all with us. And we will certainly talk about this imminent government review, even with Colin not here. You never know, we may talk more about him with him not here, I don't know. But Daniel, maybe I can start with you. Clearly you're passionate about cementing this link between government properly recognising the work of faith groups in communities. And that's very much at the heart of what you do at Faith Action, isn't it?
Yeah. So I've got a number of different hats we wear. We're working with the government, particularly the Department of Health, on the Health and Wellbeing Alliance. So we give the kind of the faith voice, faith and community voice in, but we sit alongside other groups representing different parts of UK society. And then we have had quite a bit of involvement with the Ministry for Communities, local government, housing, particularly around English language and cohesion in that sense. So so that's been a point of interest, and we are seeing, and our third hat, I suppose, is that we are the secretariat to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Faith and Society, and that group has developed a faith covenant which now 13 local authorities have signed, and we're seeing over the period of lockdown, over the period that we've faced over this past 12 months, a growing interest. I've got more officials saying to me, not whether I should work with faith, but why I shouldn't. So the questions kind of flipped around. So that's quite interesting to see what's happened there.
What do we know, Daniel, about this review that Colin's currently conducting and its parameters?
Now, I should know a lot because I filled it in myself, Hannah. So I'm just
Well,
trying
that
to
was going to be one of my questions.
the latest thing I know is I got a notification that there was so much data that they've now asked Birmingham University to help processing the data. So I suppose that's good in itself. I believe it's due to come out in the summer. And I know with civil service, the summer can stretch all the way to Christmas. So I think that it's underway. There's been a lot of, initially they were concerned that there were only particular groups that responded, but I think we've seen a much more broader response from women, from Black and minority ethnic groups, and from some of the minority faith groups as well. So I think it's got out there and got quite well responded to. Of course, it's in the midst of quite a difficult time, and that will potential people's responses may well have changed during the time of the review, but it's very broad. I certainly remember the question. I mean, it's a good 45 minutes I sat doing it.
What kind of things was it asking you?
It was asking a little bit about religious observance in that sense, but more about the place that faith groups play, the interaction back and forth with the public sector, if there's a place, if there was some work around terminology as well, which I didn't particularly dive into, but around how do we determine faith discrimination? Is there faith discrimination? Things like that. I think that's the things I remember, and I'm pleased that Colin's not here to correct me, because then he'd be able to say. But it is quite cool. But really looking at, I mean, for us, I'm here from Faith Action. It was looking at the action bit, so that I was quite keen on it in that sense.
Yeah, well, let's talk a bit about the action bit. Laura and Julie, you are so involved in so many areas of social action. Perhaps, Laura, if I can come to you first. Tell us a bit about Mitzvah Day and how it came about for you.
So first of all, thank you for having me today. Funny if I was rummaging through my papers to see what Colin's thing was about, because I thought he was going to talk about that. But it was, anyway, it doesn't matter. He had 4 particular areas he was looking at, but we can come back to that. So action is something that in the Jewish world in particular, we're very much, I think all faith groups, but there's a big sort of emphasis on what you do. And that relates both to religious ritual, but also to what we do in terms of social action and social justice. And I think that over the last 20, 30 years, in the Jewish world in particular, then a lot of people, particularly young people, have found their way into Judaism through social action. And I think that that's partly a reflective of where the Jewish community is in terms of its development, particularly in this country. So I think that would be less true in a more Orthodox community, and it would be less true where people are more ritual-led still. But a lot of Jewish people have transitioned, if you like, through questioning ritual and through questioning the role of synagogues and questioning where traditional religion fits in their lives, but have found a home for themselves, a Jewish home for themselves through social action. And there are people who will argue that this is a bad thing, and I can see that, because it definitely is a reflection of people questioning ritual and traditional Jewish practice, but it's also a good thing, because it gives people a way into their Judaism, a way to feel Jewish, even if they don't feel at home in the more traditional places of prayer and ritual and synagogue. So that's open to debate as to whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it is a thing. And it's become enormous in the Jewish community, this movement towards social action and social justice. And it's always been there. You look back to the South Africa anti-apartheid movement or to the America civil rights movement, all of those had Jewish people right at the heart of them. So this is nothing new. But I think that in terms of people getting their hands dirty, which is really where Mitzvah Day is, and people saying, we really need to do this to self-identify as Jewish people, and we want to get involved hands-on doing stuff, is new. So Mitzvah Day is born out of the belief that you can bring people together through Jewish-led social action. And Mitzvah Day is different from many of the other things I do or work I do with Julie, in that it is Jewish-led, but interfaith. So it's all about bringing people together to clean a local park, to help with a food bank, to help with loneliness. And of course, this year with the pandemic, it's been absolutely about small things you can do, particularly around food poverty and loneliness, which have been the two massive challenges of the last few months, and where we've really been able to make a difference and to reach out to people from all faiths and backgrounds and say, come on, guys, let's do this together, because it will be together. So not only addressing the social justice or social exclusion issues of poverty and loneliness, but also the massive knock-on problem of the pandemic, which is people being isolated and on their own and not coming together. Yeah. So we've done best really with that one.
Julie, so Laura talked there about working together in an interfaith way, and that's something that I know you and she have done in all kinds of ways. Tell us a bit about where you are on this and how that works, the kind of interfaith aspect of this.
Yeah, I mean, look, Laura and I met in 2012, and I was very much struck by her, ability to sort of get stuff done, I guess. And also it really kind of made me see how the Jewish community kind of does community organizing really well, and what that might look like for us as Muslims or as, people from different faiths working together, while taking into account that each faith group has a load of groups within it as well. And how do you kind of navigate that? But certainly we've always felt a couple of things. One is that friendship, bringing people together and saying to people, don't just talk about what's happening in other countries, i.e. Israel, Palestine, etc., but actually focus on home, local, building those friendships and relationships, and what kind of stuff can you do together to sort of change the world. And there's definitely something really powerful about those friendships and relationships, which then become, ways that people can do good stuff together. And I think that we've done it well, I guess I would say that, but I think, we've been able to bring the Jewish and Muslim communities together through women and doing things that these two groups have never done before. So I
and is that is that important in this, that actually maybe groups that haven't naturally come together before can unite with a kind of common purpose and common aim that can be agreed on, that you can be entirely happy that you're all wanting to do the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's that. It's also building respect and understanding each other, because that, of course, is always part of the problem. People think they know the other. It becomes, a sense of that. And then when they actually get to know each other, realize, oh, right, okay, well, she's actually worrying about the same stuff as me, rather than this kind of idea that we're all very, very different. So I think that's very powerful when people suddenly, that penny drops, people realize, oh my gosh, this narrative that I've been fed all of my life just isn't true. So that stuff is always really sort of powerful when it happens. I do think there's still a lot more that needs to be done between different faith groups when it comes to sort of local work. I think sometimes faith communities can become a bit territorial about what they do, which seems bizarre because, of course, we're all trying to do good stuff. But, if you have an organization that's been doing work in a local area for a long time, how do you, if they have perhaps elderly volunteers and it's kind of flagging a bit, and then you have around the corner, a mosque, say, with a whole load of young blood that wants to get involved, how do you kind of make that happen without those people who've been doing it a long time feeling like there's somehow people treading on their toes? So I think there's a lot more potential still to be explored, actually, with between faith groups, and trying to see how can we share resources, do stuff together, don't reinvent the wheel. A bit like I was saying, I've learned a lot from Laura and from the Jewish community in terms of community organizing. It's different for Muslims, but there's a lot of overlap, a lot of stuff we can learn from. So I think, there's loads of positive, but there's still a lot more, I think, that we can all do.
And Daniel, I know that you pull people together from all sorts of different faith groups in kind of online forums who might find it difficult to come together in other contexts. So how does that work for you?
I'm very much reminded Hannah of sitting here with Julie and Laura to something I tested out at an event I think that Julie had me speak at, Islamic awareness event, and one of the things that I felt helps people come together is somewhat the focus on the outworking. So in my very limited reading of faiths in the UK, there is a duty of each to the widow and the orphan. And the widow in today's society are those without economic independence, and the orphan is those without a place of belonging. I said this at an event, I think Laura was there certainly, and I saw people generally nod round. So I think I got my doctrine right in that sense. And I think that's the thing, the coming together. I find that people who potentially won't come together for a theological discussion will come together on a social action front. And I think that's quite important. I also think there is a measure of people, it's probably part of British psyche as well, which just wants to let me just get on and get something done. So people want to get behind something that's happening. So I was reflecting a little bit while Julie and Laura are talking about the NHS clap. It was more than a clap for the NHS. It was just an excuse to get together and speak. And actually, we, under all social distancing rules, we in July did a street hot chocolate just to try to cultivate that kind of conversation. In fact, I got more food come to me than I gave out in hot chocolate, so I did very well. But those points, if you can find something where people are agreed on, the relationship actually in my street, I live in a part of East London that we don't tend to see each other that much. But everyone came together in my street to protest against a swimming pool at the end of our street because we didn't want to have a disruption. We all now secretly use a swimming pool, but
inevitably,
it was an excuse to get together. And I think that's what's happened even more so over this period. There has been a reason for people that needs are common, and just like Julie was saying, there's a commonality to the need, and people want to get involved. And I think it's human nature in that sense. I'm always amused when I'm stuck on the tube and nobody speaks to each other until there's a delay, and then everyone talks to each other, and so we're looking for that excuse. And I think partly, because the issues of loneliness and isolation, I think we now know there are a lot of people out there who are just desperate for an opportunity to interact. And I think we need to take those opportunities wherever they provide themselves.
I mean, maybe we can just sort of pin down how we see the role of people in faith groups and faith communities. What role do they play as part of a healthy, functioning society? I mean, what is the role of the faith communities in our wider communities? Maybe Daniel, do you have a thought on that?
I think faith groups can provide a glue,
okay,
point of connection with people. Sam Wells and Russell Rook have produced an interesting book discussing the role of the NHS and the retreat of church from that space. And I think it's an interesting, I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's quite an interesting thing, that glue, that coming together. Let me give you an example just from the start of the covenant. The local authority that got behind the faith covenant was Birmingham, and the councillor who pushed it through is an atheist. And I said to him, I took him aside and said, what do you want to be involved with all these faith people for? And he said, we just have to mobilize everyone. And there was that practical thing. And then we had a conversation. He said, listen, we're still doing the bins in Birmingham. We're still running libraries. And I said, well, what about social services? I wanted to be provocative. So the difference is that when I'm in a faith setting, I can say to the congregants or people gathered, you need to love this family or this, but you can't say that to a social worker in the same sense. There is that bit that is different. I'm not saying that social workers and teachers do not love and all that kind of thing, but I do think there is a difference in that. And I think part of the discussion that maybe we're going to have more is where does it sit and what's the balance? And it's a mucky discussion. It's not very neat and tidy, but you know what? We're not neat and tidy.
No.
So I think that's kind of partly.
Laura, what's your thought on that about faith groups and their kind of place in a good society?
Well, I think following on from some of the things Daniel, faith groups are big, and I think that there's a tendency to forget that they're big. The last census, okay, it's 10 years ago, but it still showed that the majority of people in Britain self-identify with a faith group. So we tend to marginalize them, and we tend to think of them as a bit sort of offbeat. Well, we don't, clearly, because we're all in them. But I think that there is a tendency to think of them as marginalized, and actually they are not. They're mainstream. We are mainstream. And I think that if you put that hat on, it becomes very different. And I also think that people have got strong prejudices about, or stereotypes about, faith groups. So I would say that at one end, people think that the faith groups are the font of all good. You know, all the social action and all the caring and all the loving and all the loneliness is all done by the faith groups. And at the other end, you've got people who think that the faith groups are really dangerous. And, they're full of extremists. They're full of people who are very conservative, very backward in their thinking, anti-women, anti-LGBT, all of those things. And of course, the truth is that everybody's along a spectrum. But I do think that within British society, we have a stereotypical view of the faith groups that we come to conversations with. And that's not helpful, because they are such a big entity, the faith groups. So they play a major part in society. And I also think, leading on from that, I think that increasingly when I think about faith and where it plays its part in society, I often think of it as, if you like, the runt of the protected characteristics. So if you're going to work, or if you're going into a conversation in the public space, we might be talking about people's disabilities, and we talk about people's gender, and we talk about people's age, and all of these are things that we talk about and we bring to work and we bring to life. And people's faith, again, you get into that whole thing about not very comfortable with. And the spectrum of how we, as I say, we think about other people's faiths and how we think about our own faith. There is huge. I mean, Julie and I have discussed this a lot, where God fits into our lives or doesn't fit into our lives. We're all very different in terms of our feelings about our faith. So where does faith fit into society? I think it's not really faith. I think it's the faith communities. And the faith communities, because they are structures and they are entities and they are well formed, actually. And during the pandemic, we've really seen it come into its own, or them come into their own. I mean, I know that if we go back to government, or we haven't gone on to government yet, but if I bring in government in this, that maybe government hasn't till now, do they now? I don't know, but certainly hasn't till now recognized the value that the faith communities play in society, but also recognize why faith communities do it. They're doing it mostly because that's how they live their lives anyway. That's what we do. The challenge really is to get us to do it more for, if you like, the common good, and more collectively.
Well, can I just bring Julie in here, actually, because we were talking about the kind of collectively doing it, but also I just wondered, Julie, have you seen, because you've been involved in so many social action things over such a long time, do you see a change in the way we are seen by government for what you do?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's fair to say that the Muslim communities and the way we are viewed by others and also government has been, let's say, tricky and problematic, particularly over the last 10 years or so. There's no doubt that Muslims feel, there's a sort of spotlight and a kind of CCTV in a way that perhaps there isn't on other groups. Other groups also feel that. And so there's that kind of dynamic. I would say that I think particularly last year, and I wish Colin was here because I would have said it, to him as well, that the effort that the government put in to liaise, I would say, properly with faith communities was really very commendable. And, it's not easy. We are, I mean, whoever just said it, messy. I mean, each faith group is a whole load of stuff within itself, within it, each one. How you navigate who to speak to, are they, coming to the table or not? I mean, it's not easy at all. So I think I definitely was really very impressed, and I guess reassured by how the government actually put, for example, places of worship kind of right in the heart of the conversations around the pandemic, safety and all of that, consulted while also listened. We were able to genuinely give advice and then sort of somehow try and bring guidelines together that kept most people happy most of the time. You can't do it all. And I really felt that was very positive. And I really thought that in that sense, this review, in a way, a sort of continuation of that, I think is actually very positive. I think the relationship, certainly I could say, as I say, from Muslim communities' perspective, has been problematic and difficult, because if you're always seeing a community through the lens of terrorism, for example, extremism, you miss out, let's say, a whole load of people that you're not engaging with. And seeing it through that lens, of course, makes people feel defensive. And I can say that, connected with this review, I actually pulled together in literally a couple of days, two groups of women, 10, 12 Muslim women in each one, 2 days running, to have a conversation with Khalid, for him to hear from them specifically. And in both groups, there were women who said to me beforehand, I'm happy to do it, but because he was asking questions around issues and difficulties around, for example, abuse or abuse of power or spiritual things that are not perhaps working quite so well in places of worship, they were worried that, whatever they said might end up on the front of the, one of the newspapers, for example, in a way that kind of was used against us. And, for more than one or two women to say that gives you an indication of what I mean. There's definitely a thirst and a desire to engage and want to be part of these discussions. But there is a worry that some of that might be used to come back at us in a way that we've seen over the last 10 years or so. So it's not easy and it's tricky. And of course, we as faith communities have some of that in common, and specific things, anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred and racism. They're all very difficult, important issues, similarities and also differences. And how does government and those of us in the faith communities, how do we navigate all of that? I think is work in progress, right? We're not getting it right at all the time. And so I think these things are really stuff that we have to remember and think about. And also just to say, imagine for young Muslims that have been born since 9/11, they've never known any different apart from a narrative that says that they are somehow a problem in society through the narrative that some people put out.
Would it help
to a group of young people?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Would it? I mean, I just wonder whether one of the things I'd be interested to know from all of you what you hope will come out of this review. But I was wondering about the question of a faith department, because it struck me that, recommendations from this review are going to be submitted to the Communities and Housing Secretary. And everybody you look at associated with government who has anything to do with faith wears about 6 or 8 hats, one of which is faith. And I just wonder whether that's something, I think that's something that Faith Action have been looking at, Daniel, about a faith department. I mean, the US has one over various administrations. It has had various different levels of attention, shall we say, but it's back on track now, I think. But a faith department, would that help, Daniel?
I think I would say yes, partly because when you give a role to a person, I've been studying some things around diversity, and actually, if you don't give a role to someone on diversity with an organization, it always gets pushed to the back. But part of it makes me a little bit reticent is I believe that, for want of a better term, faith is a cross-cutting theme. It affects many different areas. So you don't want it to say, oh, that's his job or that's her job and it's done. So yes, because I think it kind of highlights and certainly in terms of faith-based social action, faith-based service delivery is huge. I mean, if you look at youth work, secular youth work pales in terms of size and reach to faith-based youth work, and then we can go on from there, lots of things. So there is that need for that kind of intelligent approach, I think, in that way, but not so that it becomes siloed within one department. I think that's fairly key. And if I could just comment on the lockdown government stuff,
yes,
I think what we saw and what Julie said is really important. I think the government has been quite sensitive, as much as politicians can, in the way they have been to the different things. I think what we saw in lockdown 1, if I contrast lockdown 1 to lockdown 3, in lockdown 1, it was about protecting bodies. In lockdown 3, I think it's been about protecting people. Now, the reason I see a difference with that is that there was a realizing that we as humans are more than just our body. And actually, in some of the things they've allowed, not least faith groups to remain open to some degree, but also small things like support groups and different bubbling arrangements and some of those things. I feel, I'm not claiming it all for faith, but as I've been part of the task force on places of worship, there has been an invitation for challenge. And you can see there has been some effect on some of those things. In fact, even the concept of a roadmap, we spoke a number of times and said, hey, let's not keep doing these promises, which you then have to go against. Let's have a roadmap with several different destinations where you have, if we do this, we can do this. If you can, so if it felt that we were part of the story. See, I don't want to spend all my time talking about faith. I want to talk about making a better society as well as faith. So that's my one concern about a faith department, in a sense, as if it became shoved into one angle. But I think we have seen some things develop which are very very powerful, and I think it's interesting. I'm fascinated by the nature of how government has had to change, and who thought that Boris Johnson would have been the head of a government that clamped down more personal freedoms than anyone else. I think some of those things that people have had to do are quite amazing in that sense, and I think there has been learning from them.
Laura, what would you hope might come out of this review?
Well, just following on from what Daniel was saying, in terms of you asked whether there should a faith department, and of course there is a faith department in the MHCLG, and to be fair to them, on the whole, I think they've been excellent. I mean, the civil servants they've employed, they are and have been excellent. I think one of the challenges is that they move around a lot. The Minister for Faith changes a lot. There's really been very little consistency. And I think that maybe that's a reflection of how seriously or not the thing is taken. So you can have very good civil servants, but if they're moved or the minister's moved, then that's a problem. But I also think that, and we haven't used this word yet, but it's a really big word, which is intersectionality. And even though it's become a buzzword, it's a really important word, because faith intersects with everything else. And the thing we also haven't talked about really is gender. Because in all of the faith groups are patriarchal. They just are. They always have been. And they've all struggled with the relationship with their women. And some are doing it better, and some parts of them are doing them better. But basically, these are ancient institutions, the faith communities. They have grown up patriarchal. They remain patriarchal. And in all cases, the women are battling with it, or some of the men are battling with it too. But it is a really unfinished piece of work, and that intersects with faith because so the two go together, and then they have a relationship with all the other areas of government. So let's take, for example, the online harms bill. All right, not ostensibly about women, not ostensibly about faith, but actually massively about both. Because who is really, really hit online for hate? Women of the faith groups, massively disproportionately to anybody else. So somehow we've got to build faith, as Daniel said, we've got to build that into all of the thinking, because something like the online harms bill, such a good example of it's not about faith, but it is about faith, and it's not about gender, but it is about gender. And the piece about gender, I think, is crucial to the whole way we think about faith and how we enable that the women's voices are heard and that the women's perspectives heard. And just last thing on this, which is, if you look at the pandemic, the women of the faith groups have been phenomenal. So the faith groups have been phenomenal, but who is taking the food parcel around to the old lady who lives around the corner on her own and hasn't seen anyone for a month? Who's trying to work out how to get the children to phone their grandmas? A lot of it is about the women of the faith groups. So if anything comes out of it positive, I'm hoping that one of them is a recognition that this group, and they're not all the same, and the issues affecting the Muslim women and the Jewish women are all the same, but they have been carrying an enormous amount of this load.
Well, and Julie mentioned about pulling together groups of Muslim women to talk to this, to talk about the review and submit stuff. So, right, good, excellent. So, Julie, what's your thoughts on this? What would you like to come out of it?
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see. I think what's great is that lots of people have input into it, which is always going to be useful, because hopefully it's quite a nice variety of different views and not kind of people all saying the same stuff. So I think it'll be interesting to see, and I'm looking forward to it. One thing that comes to my mind is that for some of us, or maybe all of us, or lots of us, we live in sometimes bubbles, and they're very diverse, and we've got all sorts of great stuff happening, and different people around us, and of course there's many parts of the country which are still not like that. And so I wonder sometimes about how stuff in centrally filters down. Do we have an eye on what faith groups are doing locally, and how more can be done? How are they perceived? And I think that government nationally and also locally has a role to play there, rather than just sort of let it do its own thing and hope for the best. I think there needs to be a bit more effort and look at what's happening in local areas, because some for sure are better than others when it comes to this kind of stuff. So I think that would be good. I think no doubt for me, funding is an issue. And again, it's not about, you don't actually always need endless pots of money at all. And in fact, if you look at a lot of what faith communities do, and I can say this from personal and also the other people around me's perspective, we're really good value for money. When it comes to doing stuff, you can waste a whole load of money on people who know how to write reports and say the right things, but you can also invest really smartly in people who really care, who just need a bit of money to support a worker or whatever, and actually pull stuff together really well. And I would say, something that comes to mind here is Near Neighbours, which I think has been really very powerful in terms of how it's been funded, and the groups where Near Neighbours are, where there are Near Neighbours groups and coordinators, you can see how effective it can be when it's a person's job or whatever to sort of focus on bringing people together and doing good things. So I guess for me, there's a bit about funding and approach, and that's where I would think if there is a focus or a person or a group or a department, then perhaps that kind of focus will filter through as well, and not just the sort of top level stuff, but actually how does that filter down. And of course, for me, as Laura and I have had loads of conversations about this, and the questions around gender, and the way what's actually happening on the ground and how that's perceived, and who are the community leaders, and who are who's invited to the table. And I think it's changing. I can certainly say from a Muslim perspective, the Muslim women that I'm working with, I've never seen so much will and drive and sort of passion to want to change the narrative, change the status quo, and actually speak for ourselves, rather than everybody thinking the poor Muslim women that need saving from themselves. Actually just listen, work with us, walk alongside us. We don't need people patronizing or being or discriminating, of course, but actually we're ready to work with people and not have maybe male Muslim voices speaking on our behalf, or society thinking they can speak on our behalf. We want our own space, and of course that is happening. So for me, that's very exciting, and I think that's where you change the dynamic in local but also in national conversations around faith.
Well, Daniel, you mentioned the covenant as well, and linking with local authorities. Perhaps that's a kind of way in which, you know, local groups can feel as if they're being listened to. There's a bit of collaboration there between local government as well as central government, but local government and local faith groups and the work that they're doing.
One of the groups I've been able to sit on has been the Voluntary Sectors Emergency Partnership, which is chaired by the British Red Cross. And what has been clear is where there's been an existing partnership between voluntary sector organisations and local authorities or public sector, that has been an avenue to connect. I was asked to sit on the Essex excess deaths group. Thankfully, they changed their name and they didn't have the excess deaths, which is great. But it became a vehicle to connect between faith, voluntary sector, and the county council. And I think Laura will confirm this in terms of Mitzvah Day as well, where there's already a relationship. And what we've seen is where within the locations which already had a faith covenant or a faith forum that was involved in practical things, we've seen those have become avenues for getting more happen. And what we saw happen, just as in Essex, it was about particularly focus on funeral arrangements, but then it turned on for other things and connecting, and particularly informing different groups and making sure they understood the regulations, they can understand that they were feeding in the different needs that they had within their communities and that kind of thing. So again, it's kind of something we said right earlier, it's the relationship that's so key, and part of the problem we often find is such a churn in relationships that becomes an issue in itself.
Well, we've just got a few minutes left. Arguably, I mean, it's a shame Colin couldn't join us, but I'm very glad that we've heard more from the three of you in this session. But just sum up for me how you'd like to see the development of this relationship between the government and faith groups over the next couple of years. Maybe each of you just give me a little bit on that, just to close this session. Laura, how about you?
I think that they've made a good start. I think they've introduced these round tables and everybody is getting heard. And I still think that it's very much single faith led. And I think that there's a lot more that they could do around bringing people together of different faith groups on particular topics. And those topics could be things that are very specific to COVID, like places of worship opening or stuff like that, which is basic stuff that needs to be done now. But I think there's an opportunity to get involved in all sorts of other issues that are of much broader interest, like take Uyghur Muslims, right? It's something that all of us should be getting involved in. And climate change, poverty, all of these are things which we come at from a faith group perspective. We do well on the whole, and we could be contributing much more to government about it. So I think that a willingness to listen, a commitment to being heard at a high enough level, an expectation that they will hear across the diversity of our community groups. I mean, obviously, the Jewish community is very small and quite homogeneous, but the other groups are much wider and much more diverse. So they need a commitment to the diversity, and I think that it's a good start, and also local government issues as well as national government, as you said.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And I guess I would also say that I would like to see people in government, locally or nationally, not take the faith groups for granted in terms of what has been done throughout last year. You know, I would go as far as to say that people have been kept alive by efforts of mostly volunteers. And I think there's often often people forget when, you know, if you're from an organization and you're doing something as part of your job, you might be working with people who are doing loads of work, and actually all of it is voluntary. And I think sometimes people sort of just forget. And I think there's almost a taken for granted. I certainly saw it in places here where I live, and also in others where there was almost an expectation that, you know, had the faith groups not stepped up, I'm not really sure what would have happened, to be quite honest with you, particularly early on when, you know, machinery of local government took forever to kick into place. And some of us already had loads of, you know, groups and volunteers and stuff in action very early on. So I think there's that for me. It's, you know, it's just being aware and having a bit more recognition of that, and how does that get supported, broadcast, how do people know about it, all that kind of stuff, and how can we be supported by, you know, this idea that faith is a positive force for good in this country. How can that be communicated really by all of us? But I think that government do have a role in that as well. You know, there's no doubt about it that the narrative can be negative, and I think it's unfair often when there's so much being done behind the scenes that most people don't even realize half the time.
Yeah,
so I
Julie,
think more of a recognition of that, I think, would be great.
Yeah, great. Daniel, sorry, we're really running out of time, but do please give us your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'll give some quick thoughts then. So pick out what Laura said earlier about the mainstreaming, seeing faith as mainstream. I think we have to deal with this myth of secular neutrality. I don't think there is a neutral point to be. I think we recognize that faith is it's the first in and last out. It reaches the parts that nothing else can. So in terms of actually helping people get hold and potentially using it as a way to funnel services through, I think there is a thing about faith as a conscience or a Jiminy Cricket type character that I think we're about to try and take young people and try and shove education down their throats, and what they need is go out and play and relate and connect with people. And I think faith has got a point to play in actually giving some wisdom into government and to education and to health and those kind of things. So I think there's an insight role as well there.
Well, goodness, I think we could go on talking about this for some time more. And I'm so grateful, Laura, Julie and Daniel, for that you've been with us this afternoon and for all your contributions. Thanks very much indeed.